What if the person you loved more than anyone was permanently changed by dementia and you became their caregiver? Well, your relationship would change, and you would change too. I'm Aaron, and I'm currently full-time caregiver for Diane, my wife of nearly 30 years. She's living with advanced Lewy body disease. I started the Diane Project to tell stories about our journey. Some stories are about the past. Some are about the here and now. I hope you get something from them. Today I'll be reading a story that was originally posted to Substack on April 21st, 2025, titled, "This is Kansas Day, Part 3. It's the conclusion of an essay on my wife's midlife reinvention, and it has been adapted for audio. I will link to parts 1 and 2 in the show notes. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To see the Substack version with all the links and visual content, visit thedianeproject.com. It's a blustery early spring day in Chicago, but as soon as I click on the video, I feel warmer. I'm transported to that summer night in 2003 outside a charming old house in Topeka. The house belongs to Ron and Annette Thornburg, one of the more prominent couples in the capital city of Kansas. There are people standing in clusters, chatting pleasantly on the Thornburgs' front porch. The video footage is unsteady. I'm on the lawn trying to figure out my new camcorder, which has more buttons than a Shakespearean costume. As I take a few shaky establishing shots, I hear a woman's laugh above the chatter and think, I know that laugh. Inside the house, people are holding drinks and talking in groups, and moving among them is a tall, friendly lady in a black dress whose badge identifies her as Marion Cott, director of the Kansas Humanities Council. These are her people, donors, board members, allies in government. Originally from Iowa, Marion has spent 30 years building the KHC into a force for good in her adopted state, promoting civic values and lifelong learning. It awards dozens of grants a year in support of small-town and rural-friendly projects, oral history, film festivals, educational talks. KHC's big initiative in 2003 was a traveling exhibit titled Produce for Victory, Posters on the American Homefront. But tonight is about a much more ambitious project that's launching next year, 2004. And like the Diane Project, it has my wife at the center. Since the 1980s, the KHC has sponsored the Kansas portion of the Great Plains Chautauqua, a 5-state roadshow that mixes enlightenment with entertainment. It features a traveling band of scholars who give talks during the day and perform as historical characters, Sacagawea, Teddy Roosevelt, etc., at night outdoors under the big top. To mark the 150th anniversary of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 2004, Marion wanted KHC to have its own Chautauqua. This one would shine a light on the often overlooked role that Kansas played in the lead-up to the Civil War, as I described in Part 2 of this series. Diane applied for the part of Clarina Nichols, and despite her lack of scholarly background or acting experience, the KHC chose her. And tonight she's starring in a VIP preview of the 2004 Bleeding Kansas Chautauqua. We're doing it at the home of the Thornburgs because Annette is on Marion's board and is married to the Kansas Secretary of State. Ron was elected to 4 consecutive terms as a moderate Republican, back when those creatures roamed the earth. You would never know this is Diane's performance debut. I mean, there she is on the front porch, minutes before showtime, just yakking with folks like it's a charity event for St. Francis Hospital in Evanston, where she was the director of public relations in the 80s. All of her familiar qualities are on display. Her smile, attentiveness, good humor. But what people probably noticed is the incredible 19th century period costume she has on. The wig, designed with the ringlets that Clarinna wore in her hair. The dress, inspired by New England styles of the day and made for her by a Lawrence quilter and dressmaker. Once everyone goes inside and is seated, Diane is introduced by Marion. She delivers a half-hour monologue crafted from Clarinna's own writings. She answers a few questions as Mrs. Nichols, then takes off her wig and answers questions as Diane. The video is posted to the Substack version of this story. The Bleeding Kansas Chautauqua kicked off in Junction City the first week of June 2004. Most of our family attended that one. Next up was dusty Colby, Kansas, all the way out west. Then historic Fort Scott in the state's southeast corner. The finale, which played to the biggest crowds, took place in Lawrence's South Park, near the University of Kansas. Each site was treated to 5 nights of performances. College professors Fred Krebs and Richard Johnson debated amicably as Lincoln and Douglas. David Rice Atchison and John Brown, a.k.a. Dave Dickerson and David Matheny, each got his own night. Charles Everett Pace breathed fire into Frederick Douglass's 4th of July address. Diane's performance in Lawrence was memorable, and not just because the tent was filled to capacity. In the audience was Janice Parker, a direct descendant of Clarinna Nichols, whose grandmother Diane had interviewed for her book and had told Diane that her name was pronounced Clarinna, not Clarina. Janice brought a very special heirloom with her, the brooch that Clarinna wore in the 1843 picture that I featured on the cover of Diane's biography titled Revolutionary Heart. Diane wore it for her performance that night. The book came out in 2007, and with support from the KHC, Diane kept doing her one-woman show. The demand seemed endless. It wasn't easy for Diane to put on a period outfit, perform a script from memory, and take questions from audience members she couldn't see because of her poor vision. And yet, I'll bet she did it 100 times. Had Marion Cott not retired and the KHC put an end to the Living History program, Diane would probably be performing in that wig and dress until her diagnosis. Well, she probably wouldn't have made it quite that far, but that's a story for another day. She had a new master's degree and the tools of historiography, so she went into the history business. The humanities councils in Missouri and Kansas wanted relevant talks on history. The pay was enough, and we could sell books afterwards. Over the next 15 years, with me as her driver and later as her partner, we covered most every highway in 2 states. Diane gave different talks over the years, but they always had something to do with women's struggle for basic rights or the roles of women in the Civil War era. These topics were not only novel and interesting to her audiences, but they gave Diane an excuse to work Clarinna Nichols into every single talk. After I left the newspaper in 2012, we became a writing-lecturing team, leading Osher Institute classes, addressing Civil War roundtables across the Midwest, and even once appearing on C-SPAN. We published books on local history and women in the Civil War, and we were working on our most ambitious book project when it all came to a sudden stop in 2020. It was Louis, not COVID, that put us out of business. Diane's diagnosis forced us to drop everything and pivot to downsizing and moving. We never gave another talk, and we shelved our work in progress. By the time we arrived in Evanston in 2022, Diane had forgotten that she was the one who had given Clarinna Nichols her place in history. But turns out there was someone in Kansas who hadn't forgotten Diane. I received this email out of the blue last November. Hello, my name is Phyllis Pease, and I am the artist that is working on the Kansas Suffragist Memorial. Clarinna is front and center of my painting, and in my sketch I have her wearing the memorial brooch. Would you happen to have a better photo of it? Having no idea what this suffragist memorial was, I searched online and learned that it was a project of the Kansas League of Women Voters, at whose convention Diane once spoke. The memorial was actually an 8 by 19-foot mural that an artist named Phyllis Garibay Kuhn had been selected to paint. The mural would be permanently installed on the first floor of the Kansas State House in Topeka, 2 floors down from one of the most illustrious murals in America, John Stuart Curry's tragic Prelude, famous for its 20-foot-high, hair-on-fire portrait of the abolitionist John Brown. I could only find an early sketch of the mural, titled Rebel Women. There was Clarina, holding a lamp, leading a legion of suffragists. It had the feel of a traditional, overstuffed historical mural with a bit of comic book flair, but it also had a special quality. It seemed so joyous. Even in rough draft form, it made my heart leap. Tears welling up, I sent Phyllis a photo of Diane wearing Clarina's brooch. Phyllis wrote back, "Oh my gosh, Aaron, this is a great picture. Thank you so much for sharing this with me. I've read all of Revolutionary Heart. I think Clarina is an amazing woman. And if I could go back in time, that's who I'd want to meet." Now I wanted to know all about this mural and the woman bringing it to life. So I got Phyllis on Zoom with Diane sitting next to me. I asked her why she introduced herself to me as Phyllis Pease when she was planning to sign her painting Phyllis Garibay Kuhn.
So I got divorced several years ago, and I haven't officially changed my name back to my maiden name because it was in the State House. And my parents are Kansans, and his family is from Nebraska. It just kind of prompted me to I want to honor my family. I wanted to honor both my parents because they went through a lot to be married because it was a mixed marriage. My mom's Mexican. She immigrated when she was a child from Michoacan, and they ended up in Kingman County and farm. They're both farm families. He's German, Scotch, Irish. They moved from Illinois. That's the other thing. It was a mixed marriage because my mother was Catholic, but my dad was not. My mother passed away several years ago, but my dad's 100. So he is still alive and kicking. And that really a wonderful story of these two people that met and got married and had 10 kids and farmed. My mom was just the fire, So my dad, quiet. He's just every day he's asked my sisters, how's the painting going? What's going on? I'm so excited for Wednesday. So that's why I changed it. And I'll start signing my art that way too.
How did this project come about? How was it commissioned? And then how were you commissioned?
The League of Women Voters and the AAUW. It goes through the state, but it's all privately funded. League of Women Voters made the proposal and they were granted the space. They put the net out for artists, and they wanted Kansas artists. I've done one big painting at the zoo here, Sunset Zoo, and I have a painting at Kansas State University, and I love to paint big, and it's kind of nostalgic, inspired. I had not heard about this project. I don't know how they advertised it, but not well enough because they didn't get enough input. And so they extended the deadline. A woman came into our small business. They have a little bakery and a restaurant and said, "Hey, your mom should do this project." So I applied, and they narrowed it down to 5 artists. And then each artist had to present their idea. And they gave us a list of 20 women, and there's a snippet on each one of them. Of course, Clarina is on the first page. So I read Revolutionary Heart. And then after I started reading about Clarina, I said, "Oh, she's a freaking superhero. She is the one in front and center." There was a guy he teaches at KU, and he's a heavy hitter. And I'm I can't believe I'm up against this dude. But one, he's a dude. And the League of Women Voters were we really want a woman to paint this painting. I kind of got a peek of some of the other people's ideas. They kind of focused on nationwide suffragists, a general story, as opposed to the Kansas women. Anyway, so I did the research. The preservation committee chose me to be the artist with changes. They didn't have a problem with my composition or what I had in it. And I had Lawrence burning. I had the territorial capital, the border wars, because Clarina's sons fought in the border wars. So that was great. I said, okay. And I was a graphic designer. That's what I graduated and worked in a firm. And so I understand, design by committee. And I expected, there to be some changes. We worked together to choose the women, but they always wanted Clarina to be featured in the project.
Phyllis's painting has dozens of people in it, but in the front are 13 women. About half of them are arranged in a superheroes Avengers flying wedge, with Clarina Nichols at the forefront. These women were chosen by the Memorial Committee for their contributions to the Kansas suffrage movement between 1859 and 1920.
There's a plaque that will sit underneath the painting, and there will be a key, but it will number from left to right, each of the suffragists, and it has their name, what town they were from. And what's cool is like these are people that existed in time. They have hundreds and hundreds of kids come there, through there every day. Teachers and
It's going to be fantastic.
the tour guides are so excited. Well, I was just there for a while, hours. The tour guides, every one of them would stop and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to now come down this hall and talk about these women." And they were already rearranging their tours in their head. And one of them said, "I'm going to have to cut something out. I know exactly what I'm going to cut out." So she can make it to that hallway.
Rebel Women was unveiled by Governor Laura Kelly on Kansas Day, January 29th, 2025. Phyllis's sisters were on hand, but her 100-year-old father never saw the finished mural. He had passed the day before. I had yet to see the finished mural, so I began hunting for images online. One search led me to the website of Kansas Public Radio's KPR Presents, hosted by Kay McIntyre. When Revolutionary Heart came out, Kay had dedicated an entire episode to Clarina's story and had interviewed Diane. Ahead of the Kansas Day ceremony, Kay interviewed Phyllis, and she took a photograph of a portion of the finished mural that was included on the page with the podcast. In the photo, Phyllis is standing in front of Clarina Nichols and pointing at a detail. There was the brooch and something else that hadn't been in earlier photos: the knitting needles. This was Diane's favorite detail from the 1859 Free State Constitutional Convention. Clarina attended every day and sat in the press section, and she brought her knitting. A New York Times reporter sitting next to her wrote this line that Diane loved to quote: "Mrs. Nichols sits at the reporter's table every day, some of the time plying her needle, some of the time her pen." Imagine sitting in a smoke-filled room of shouting Republicans and Democrats, and then, during a lull in the action, hearing the click-click of needles. Diane loved that detail, and so did Phyllis. The moment I saw this picture, I felt overwhelmed. As I listened to the podcast, I just stared at that picture on my screen and sobbed helplessly. Diane held my hand tightly in silence. I know I have put forward a cheerful and somewhat brave face during this season of the Diane Project. It's not an act. Well, it's not an act any more than Diane performing as Clarina Nichols, a woman with whom she deeply identified despite the century and a half between them. Any more than that was an act. This person I've been speaking as, this is who I am now. I'm a manly caregiver. In my experience, women and men have distinct ways of projecting strength and assurance. Diane and I complemented each other. At times, I put a little steel in her spine. Other times, she tamed this bull in the china shop. I'm perfectly comfortable now taking my wife to church every week and parking her wheelchair in the front row. I've gotten pretty good at talking about Diane's dementia and making care for her sound as natural as any other family activity. I'm not a hero any more than any other human who was conscripted into the army of caregivers. Several dads I know have kids who were born with special needs. We can relate to each other. I would like to see more men lean into caregiving roles. They can handle it better than they think. Also, I believe that having more men take on the responsibilities of care instead of looking for the nearest available woman would be a huge cultural shift for the good, and we need one of those right now. Having said all of that, I must admit that my description of life as a manly caregiver has not been complete. We must now talk about the hardest part of the job, which is the emotional part, specifically grief. It's been 3 months since I first set eyes on Phyllis Garibay-Kuhn's inspiring mural, and it still reduces me to tears. I can't look at it or even think about it much without watering up. This isn't the "so proud of you" trickle tear that rolls down the cheek when your loved one is recognized for an achievement, though it did make me mighty proud to see Clarina front and center, leading the Avengers. No, I'm crying because I'm grieving. And I've been grieving a long time. Watching Diane go through all the changes the first 2 years after her diagnosis was hard. In real time, I lost not only our partnership, but eventually I lost her companionship as well. Elissa Strauss, the author of When You Care, whom I interviewed in my first issue, interviewed me for CNN.com about caregiver grief. The takeaway of her story is that caregivers often have no choice but to deal with their emotions while at the same time doing their best to care for a loved one. That describes me to a T, but until I read Elissa's story, I hadn't really looked at it that way. So then, I began thinking more about the role of grief in my caregiving journey. As you've followed me on the Diane Project, you've seen how I relish the challenge of caregiving. It gives me a sense of accomplishment to do right by my baby. But if I think back over the past 3 years, there have been many moments when I've been alone and heard a sad song on the radio or found myself awake in the wee small hours and surrendered to my sorrow. I looked back at my story about Soup Club and realized, oh, hey, there I am, coping with my grief in very practical ways. I'm turning off the news to avoid piling on the pain. I'm making new friends, rebuilding my social network so I can regain some of the emotional support I lost when Diane got sick. Then there was my story, This is the KISS Test, where I quoted caregiving coach Pat Snyder telling me that after this journey,
you're going to be able to love more deeply, have much more compassion, because you had to.
Pat and I didn't talk about grief, probably because I didn't want to. With the Clarina mural, though, the walls of resistance came crashing down. That led to this 3-part Kansas Day series on my wife's midlife reinvention. I knew I couldn't write about my grief without giving you a sense of all that I lost. By now, I hope you understand why I said in the opening lines of the Diane Project that she is the woman to whom I owe everything, and why I am glad to be her full-time caregiver for as long as it takes to give her a safe and gentle landing in the next dimension. My friend Rick Hudgens wrote a good reflection recently on grief and grievance. He notes that men who act out in anger are usually avoiding their own pain. By confronting pain, we experience grief, and grief is the necessary antidote to the poison of grievance. We are all capable of addiction to grievance, Rick writes. We must remind ourselves regularly that loss is constant and universal. He's right. I could just as easily have avoided the pain and spent those years in a state of anger over the unfairness and cruelty of cognitive illness. I know some male caregivers who have anger issues, and all I can say is, there but for fortune go I. It certainly worked to my benefit that this wasn't my first rodeo. My caregiving journey with Diane spans the course of a long and fruitful marriage. Indeed, that through line of mutual care is one reason why our marriage has been long and fruitful. For how much longer, though? On Palm Sunday, I told our faith community that we are transitioning Diane to hospice care. I told them that not much was changing, that everything will stay home-based, but now I'm getting some extra and much-needed help. The truth, however, is that things are changing. I still go in for the kiss test, but her kiss is getting weaker. I look in those tired eyes, and I hold that hand with its still, strong grip. She's hanging on, but I can feel that still, strong grip loosening. I think this will end beautifully for her, but I'm going to be a wreck. I've decided to take a break from the Diane project. We'll call this the Season 1 finale. I plan to return with Season 2 in the fall. In the next 4 weeks, I'm going to run a marathon. I'm going to celebrate my 60th birthday and our 30th wedding anniversary. And I'm going to Kansas for a grandson's high school graduation. And I will visit the State House in Topeka to see rebel women in person. I will bring tissues. Don't forget to subscribe where you get your podcasts. Please visit thedianeproject.com. If there are any major developments on the home front, of course I will pass them along. Until next time, take care.